there was a famous Avadi resolution of the Congress in 1956, where they said they will put the public sector at the commanding heights of the economy. Basically, it is an extension of the socialist principle that all the means of production, as far as possible, should be government controlled and government owned. In the early days, it was merely controlling the means of production. But they did not try to go into licensing in a big way. But slowly that system in the 60s and most of all in 70s, during Indira Gandhi's time, it morphed into a license permit quota Raj.
License permit quota Raj basically means if you want to produce something, you require a license. The idea being that you give a license so that adequate quantities are produced. That is the theory at those days. If you don't have a license, then people go and invest in production of unnecessary things may happen. That is the assumption. That the government knows which is good, what should be produced, what should not be produced, and prices are controlled.
What is Adam Smith's principle? The invisible hand of the market. When the demand exceeds supply, the price goes up. When the supply exceeds demand, the price goes down. When the price goes down, people exit from that sector, they will not produce. When the price goes up, they enter into the sector. After some time, the supply matches demand, therefore price is moderated. Therefore, price is a signal. Price is the most important signal in economic activity. That is how the pricing operates. Instead of understanding this, what did we say? We said we know what is needed, in what quantity. Therefore, we decide who will produce, how much. And mostly, we alone will produce.
The whole assumption is government knows better than the people. Secondly, exports. You see, we should not export. We will export when there is a surplus. Otherwise, we require our own money. So there is a quota for import, there is a quota for export. You will export only when there is surplus. You will import when there is shortage. That's one. Similarly, if you want to produce something, you should have a license. If you want to consume something, you should have a quota.
I was a subjudicial magistrate from 82 onwards. People stood in queues in front of my office to get a cement permit. With your money, you wanted to buy 100 bags of cement, either to build an extra room or to undertake repairs of your old home. Your money. You need it for your house. You are paying for it. And you are required to take permit from me to buy cement for your house. In those days, they thought it was normal. Imagine how insulting it is, how corrupt it is.
It's unimaginable for people today that there was a time when you had to wait for a gas cylinder, get letters from MPs for a telephone connection, or that there was the choice of flights was between a cancelled flight and a delayed Indian Airlines flight.
Technology, for instance, we created barriers deliberately.
Companies were required to first export before they imported a computer. Companies didn't get data transmission, telecom connectivity.
Even television, we didn't have a chance. On Doordarshan and that's it. And we like it or not, we had to watch that. One All India Radio and that's it.
Rajiv Gandhi in 1985 had decided to allow liberalization of imports. But he said to the industrialists, you import what you want, but you must pay for it by loans you take abroad, and then you pay the loans there. So people are thrilled. So they bought plants, for example, Ambani bought this Jamnagar plant, they bought, and all the industry which was lying dormant, they got spare parts, new machines, etc. But the problem was that the loans they took abroad were short-term loans. And, machinery and all can't produce results the next day. So these loans became due in 5 years. Short-term loans are, 3 to 5 years period. So at the end of 5 years, we had no foreign exchange of that kind of amount. So these industrialists wanted to convert their money into foreign exchange. We didn't have foreign exchange.
We were in that situation. And the stress started with global developments. And then the stress became a crisis for two reasons. Domestically, political instability. Nobody was really in charge with VP Singh, Mandal agitation, these things happening. And externally, Russian trade was made as vulnerable.
Where did Soviet Union collapse? Even if you are God, even if you are a supercomputer, you cannot decide what millions of people want, at what price they are willing to buy, what commodity they are going to buy. And therefore, the system eventually collapsed. All these communist countries, which went by the same philosophy, they understood, it collapsed. In 91, Soviet Union itself collapsed. Eastern Europe entered a Soviet sphere. All the countries rejected socialism. China rejected in 78. India continued it until 1991.
On top of it, trigger Gulf War took place. Oil prices shot up. So it was a combination of circumstances that resulted in triggering of a crisis. So by 1991, all facilities from IMF is used. Most of the reserves were used. Import compression took place. Short-term credit was taken. NRI deposits were not only taken, but withdrawn prematurely. So even the numbers which you give do not represent the reality. These numbers are low, but they are low after huge suffering that is going on.
By January, India had foreign exchange enough only for a few weeks of imports. The estimates vary between 3 weeks and 1 week.
Even that is not correct, because 2 weeks, they will say so much number that will finance 2 weeks imports. But the reserves are required not only to finance imports. When the NRI depositor wants money back, you have to give that also. Then you have to also repay the short-term debt due. So even the 3 weeks, 4 weeks is an overstatement. It is virtually not available for 3 days.
And please remember, India is heavily dependent on imports. Even if you do not import other commodities, even if you are willing to sacrifice a great deal, without importing fuel and fertilizer, the country would not survive.
At that time, the finance minister and finance ministry officials were going capital by capital, world capitals, trying to get governments to help India.
We tried to negotiate with the IMF.
One of the conditions that the IMF put for India is that we are giving you a bailout package, we are giving you a loan, but what is India going to do? And so government of India had one option. The RBI Act provides that a part of the country's gold reserves in a situation can be pledged or sold.
To pledge that in the market there, they did not even trust us keeping it here with RBI in Mumbai. We had to physically shift it by airplane secretly in order to get loan in dollars.
The amusing part of it is we tried to keep it very secret. And suddenly the news burst. Why? Because the tire burst. When the gold was being transported in a van, the tire burst. The tire burst is not the news, but there was heavy security. Nobody would have noticed the security. But when the tire burst, everybody got scared. So the whole armed people surrounded the gold van in the dead of the night in Bombay. So naturally that made news. And one enterprising fellow followed the vehicle after the tire was fixed. And naturally it slowly went up to the aircraft. And that fellow took the photograph of the aircraft. The journalist from a distance took the photograph of the aircraft.
The photograph of that Indian Express published, my article, of India pledging its gold reserves, that hit home. It sort of brought the enormity of the crisis to the people. For Indians to pledge gold is like, family silver being pledged or family gold being pledged.
The gold selling is important not merely because we got some money out of the selling of the gold. It gave confidence to the rest of the world that we are so determined that we will even sell the gold and discharge our obligations.
What India had to do was more or less decided.
I had already prepared the blueprints, got it passed by the cabinet, but the government fell.
You can imagine how perilous our situation was.
It's not as though economic solutions were unknown, they were known, but somebody had to do it. That required political will. Skill was available with administration. We had many eminent economists, many civil servants. But somebody has to give that political push.
Country was on the verge of collapse. And then came a breath of fresh air.
Narasimha Rao, he was part In fact, he was one of the high priests of the commanding heights of economy philosophy during the Nehruvian and Mrs. Gandhi's time, Rajiv Gandhi's time. He was one of the architects of the Congress resolutions. He was one of the draftspersons of the Congress resolutions.
He was a Pakka socialist in the 80s. He used to have quarrels with me on this. What is all this? He was very pro-Soviet also. Suddenly there was a change.
Narasimha Rao understood all this, and understanding that the system is dysfunctional.
If he had looked around for advice, many people would have recommended that he should do what they actually did. But there would be some recommending moving in the opposite direction. And you should read some of the papers written by the left front economists at that time.
Oh, the BJP was totally opposed to reforms. They had no clue of what we were doing. They were the Swadeshi types, and they thought that autarkic system was the best way to promote growth. Well, to be fair, a lot of parties thought the same way. Even the Congress party was a strong advocate of socialism and protection for many, many years.
He belongs to a political party which was running the show all the time with the old policy. So now he is the leader of a party which is committed to old policy. He has to convince the whole world that he is now starting a new policy. How do you do it? Brilliant move. He brought Manmohan Singh as the finance minister. And he called it Manmohan Singh's reform.
A Manmohan Singh, a technocrat, was brought in, given the responsibility, and all the limelight was given to Manmohan Singh.
So the moment you say it is Manmohan Singh's policy, the whole policy became apolitical. The policy became apolitical, the policy became neutral, and the policy became handling a crisis and looking at a future after experiencing the pain of the crisis.
Then he appointed outstanding civil servants. A.N. Verma as Principal Secretary to Prime Minister.
The cabinet secretary was critical. Naresh Chandra, one of the finest officers. Y.V. Reddy. Dr. Rangarajan followed Mr. Venkatramanan, who was RBI governor.
Mr. Narasimha Rao was a soft-spoken man. Manmohan Singh was a quiet sort of man. These are not very rough and tough people. Therefore, he created a very tough bureaucrat. He gave him a mandate. He said, you break through all the bureaucratic shackles. This is the mandate. Government must move in unison. And they did it not to the minimum extent required. Many countries, what did they do? To the extent that I wanted to get IMF loan, some conditions are imposed. I say, all right, bhai, kuch karenge. I'll get the loan. I'll forget about it. I will move on. He did not do that. He said, here is an opportunity. Let's change the course.
I think one of the reasons why we had pressure on the external front was overvalued Indian rupee. And in order to boost exports, it was necessary to make a correction in the valuation.
In other words, when there is a gap between import and export, you have to increase the exports. You must make exports attractive. You must make imports expensive. How do you make imports expensive? Price the dollar high. Exports, so that is called. So the question is, exchange rate has an influence on the price at which the imports and exports take place. So if it is an unrealistic exchange rate, then there is an imbalance. So if you want to correct the imbalance, then you have to have a realistic exchange rate.
Prime Minister Narasimha Rao was initially fully supportive of the two-step devaluation. But after the first step was taken on July 1, I think he developed some reservations. I know that he wanted the second step to be paused. In fact, at his instance, I went across to Dr. Manmohan Singh to convey to him that the Prime Minister would like to reconsider the matter and could the second step be paused. But I think Dr. Manmohan Singh had already made up his mind, and he was stalling. And I think he and Dr. Rangarajan must have spoken to each other. And Dr. Rangarajan was Deputy Governor of the RBI, made himself, quote unquote, unavailable There was no mobile telephone in those days. So the second step was also done.
But the real question is, why there was depreciation 67? Our experience with depreciation 67 was very bad. It did not solve a problem. We had more problems. Therefore, people were afraid. 67 there was a depreciation, there was a problem. Why are you bringing again another depreciation in 1991? The answer is simple. In 67 there was depreciation, but there was no liberalization of imports exports. So the fundamental problem of controls remained. Only the price changed. See, if the price changes and if you don't allow supply and demand to function, then its imbalance continues. This time, it was very clear that we will depreciate, we will liberalize. Once we liberalize imports and exports, then the price is determined by supply and demand. That is why this was important. And from that day till today, we don't have exchange rate as a serious problem.
And the same day, that evening, we did the trade policy changes. He was fully supportive. It was prepared in the Commerce Ministry. It had the approval of the Finance Minister, and we took it to him. And the only thing he wanted to know was whether I had signed the file and whether Dr. Manmohan Singh had signed the file. And when both of us said, yes, we have signed the file, he signed it off immediately.
He comes from a state like Andhra Pradesh in which new businesses were coming up. Whether it is Nagarjuna Fertilizers, whether it's Pennar Cements, a lot of new businesses were coming up. And all those South Indian businessmen were complaining that this whole license permit Raj is controlled by these chaps sitting in Delhi, Bombay, Calcutta. All the Marwadis, the Birlas, the Goenkas, they all control this system. They are getting all the licenses. We are not able to get in.
And those people who were making money were controlling the economy and the politics substantively.
So I think Narasimha Rao understood that the only way in which new business can grow, particularly in the south and west, is by ending the system. Industrial delicensing was 100% Narasimha Rao.
Industrial policy resolution went to the cabinet. It had been drafted in the Ministry of Industry, which was under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. That resolution was stoutly opposed in the cabinet. The senior members of the cabinet, who were from the days of Indira Ji, and they thought that this was a departure from the Nehruvian path. So I think Mr. Narasimha Rao quickly sensed that there was too much opposition to the resolution as it was, and then said, all right, we will reconsider and bring it back. We didn't do too much. We only changed the preamble. We added a passage from Jawaharlal Nehru, a passage from Indira Gandhi, a passage from Rajiv Gandhi, and then we changed the preamble to say it is change with continuity. We took back that resolution back to the cabinet, and this time the cabinet approved it straight away.
He managed the Congress party. His knowledge of history was so strong. He brought out all these resolutions of the past to convince the Congress party that they should not oppose.
Very often there's a completely wrong impression that we were just sitting there helpless and IMF had to be asked to assist, and the IMF wrote our policies and we signed them. And this is just rubbish.
When the IMF managing director called on Narasimha Rao, Michel Kamdasu, and Kamdasu gave him a long lecture. At the end of it, Narasimha Rao said to Kamdasu, Mr. Kamdasu, I am willing to do whatever is in the interest of my country. Whatever advice you are giving, I am willing to implement all that. I have only one bottom line, that no Indian will be unemployed because of what I do.
So I think the crisis triggered the reforms. The IMF enabled us to do the reforms more gradually.
The IMF has been seen as an organization that destroys people's lives. But in India, I think Narasimha Rao ensured that that did not happen. No public sector company fired a single worker. That was an achievement, political achievement.
His courage is striking when you see governments even today say that this is politically difficult, this is politically not possible. But here's a person within 20 days or 25 days of being sworn in, he changed the picture of India.
Therefore, let us use this as an opportunity to end this license permit quota Raj to the extent possible, fully and permanent. That is his genius, not a temporary thing. He changed the dynamic of economics in the country. He brought the market economy truly to the country by a series of steps, systematic steps. In those days, when a budget speech was made by Manmohan Singh, it was listened to as if it was a prime-time television show. An entertainment show like Mahaprastanam, Ramayana, or some other very popular show on TV, it was listened with rapt attention because each budget, dramatic changes were brought about.
India's 1991 reforms will be the blockbuster of independent India. It is the biggest change that came. No previous crisis was as large and no reform has been as dramatic, as wide-ranging and as politically dangerous as he did it.
You see, it is the greatest experience for me for two reasons. One, I was there sitting in the middle of everything, going from despondency to hope. And afterwards in my career, the hope was realized. Okay. Secondly, these 3 years, there were 3 prime ministers, there were 3 finance ministers, there were 3 finance secretaries, there were 3 governors, there were 3 chief economic advisors. That's so much of movement that was happening. And I was one fellow who was sitting there who had a continuous knowledge of everything, familiarity with everything. So I was able to assist them. So at the end of it, therefore, my profile changed, my understanding changed. So it's not only the country that came out of a crisis with a great future, but personally, I moved from being a sort of an ordinary joint secretary to somebody who was known to many people, at least hardworking and sincere. And most important is that P.V. Narasimha Rao leadership enabled the freedom for many people to think and act.